Today's project will be trying a lot of different watercolor techniques. To start this out, look over this watercolor painting page. Watercolor paints are paints that the pigment is mixed with a water-based solution so that when you add water, it becomes paint. The paint is meant to be transparent. In other words, it should be see-through. And there are different ways of using it, and that's what we're going to practice today. You will need to look at the page in your workbook that looks like this. It is page number 12. It follows this watercolor painting page in your workbook. You will need to get into your workbook in the back pocket. You should have a messy mat. If you have paper left in here from the beginning of the year that's really good and heavy, feels almost like a piece of poster board, you will use that. Or you may have picked up more at school, which was available at the end of October for pickup for creating art projects. So you will want this heavy-duty piece of paper, a messy mat, and of course your watercolor set. Now my watercolor set is one we've used in the classroom for a couple of years now, and it's still very good and still very usable. Your watercolor set, you got a brand new one if you're working from home with this video. You got a brand new one at the beginning of the year, and if you take good care of it, it will not only last you this whole year of art projects, you'll have it to use even after that. So today is a lot about new techniques to try, as well as making sure we're taking good care of our set of watercolors. Now, besides our watercolors, of course you will need a brush and your water in some kind of a container that you can swish it around and wash it without spilling it everywhere. You will want a paper towel. For some of the effects, you want some kind of sticker or some type of tape. Any kind will do. You will also want a crayon, preferably white or a light color. And if you have some salt in your house, which most of us do, we're going to try a fun technique using salt. You will also need some type of pencil or pen and a straw if you have it at home. If not, you can blow on your paint without a straw, but a straw does really help. So gather your supplies and join me back here. Now before we set our paint area up, there's one change you need to make on this worksheet. It has a technique that you use, alcohol, the word that you see right here. And we use rubbing alcohol to create a special technique with watercolor, but many of you might not have that at home, or you're saving it right now for sanitizing. So you can cross that out. We're not going to be trying that one today. And instead, we're going to try something with salt, because most households have salt, and we certainly have it here in the art room to use. So the things we'll be using today would be salt, straws, stickers or tape. Then we're going to use a brush to give us the wet on dry, the dry brush, and the wet on wet. Have this next to you, but a little bit away so that you're not getting paint on it. Same thing with your Chromebook. If you're using your Chromebook to watch this today, make sure that's in a safe distance away from your paint and your water so that you don't have a chance of spilling any water on it. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is use that heavy-duty piece of paper. We're going to make little rectangles on this that later on we will cut out and glue in our worksheet. This paper is just so thin that it doesn't work great for watercoloring on, so we're actually going to watercolor on heavy paper, cut out our samples, and put them into our workbook later. So you have 6 rectangles that you're working with. I'd like you to draw actually 9 rectangles in here to give you some extras just in case. So they don't have to be perfectly sized. You're just going to carefully make a line across and a line across. So it's about divided into 3 spaces. And then we're going to divide those into 3 spaces. So if you come in and try to say, oh, is that about equal? Is this space equal to the middle space and equal to the space over here? If so, that's where you want your next lines to go. So it might help to give you some little marks at the top and then kind of follow down at the bottom. You notice I'm not worried that these are perfectly straight lines. I'm doing my best to try to make them straight, but I'm not going to worry about getting a ruler out because we're just going to be cutting. These are little sample, what sometimes artists call thumbnail sketches. It's because they're so small. We're just doing some practice things here. So the first one, we're going to try the salt, and I am just looking at this and working my way across. You may want to use the words that are at the bottom and write them below what you try so you know later how to match them up. So first I'm going to try salt, then I'm going to try straws, then stickers, then wet on dry, dry brush, and wet on wet. The first thing we do with the salt is that we want first to get a nice amount of water on our brush. I'm dipping it in, getting it good and wet. I want a somewhat dark color. It will work out better. It will show better with a good dark color. So a red, a brown, a blue, a purple, any of those would be fine. I'll wake mine up by first, these are completely dry, so there's not any water in them yet. So I'm going to just wake it up a little by dripping water in it, patting it lightly with my brush. I'm not digging down in there. One mistake sometimes kids make is they dig into the paint and it gets more on the brush than it needs to. Remember, watercolor paints want to be see-through. So I'm going to start by wetting my paper with a nice amount of paint. It needs to, my brush is up on its toes. And I'm just giving myself a little sample. And here's where we needed that salt. This has to happen while it's wet, so make sure you have your salt ready before you paint. While it's wet, I'm going to sprinkle some salt in here. And I'm just going to let it sit. And while I'm painting my other things, you might see what happens to my salt and what happens to the paint around it. We're just going to let that sit. I'm going to make sure I have any extra salt off the rest of my paper. And now I'm ready to do something with a straw. If you don't have a straw at your house, you can try blowing on it without a straw. It will work, it just might not work quite as well. Again, I'm going to try a dark color so it shows up. Come down in here, I wanted a nice rich dark color. Yes, you will be able to see through it, but it should have some color to it. I'm going to make sure my brush is good and wet with paint. And I'm just going to dab it in a couple of puddles. So I want puddles of paint for this one. I have done a project with kids in the past where we've kind of made a tree out of these straw ones. Now you take your straw and blow on it and see what happens. The next one is where you're going to use stickers or tape. I happen to have some really thin tape, but if you have thick tape, it's okay to use that and just tear it into pieces. For this, I'm just going to quickly get some of this thin tape out and put that across. We're just kind of figuring out what's going to happen when we put tape down first and then paint. Now I notice where I blew with my straw, it's run into this area, so I'm going to make sure I don't paint quite that far. I don't want that to connect. Oh, I have some puppy dogs, so maybe I'll try to see what happens with the puppy dogs. Okay, so now I'm going to just dab some color around there. Again, we're just trying different things out to see what happens with the different techniques that I'm using. I'm going to start by just painting right over top of the stickers and the tape. Again, I want it really nice and wet. I'm not going to go back over it too many times, just paint over it once, and then we're going to let it dry. Now we're moving on to what it looks like when you have a wet brush on a dry piece of paper. So I'm going to take some purple that's already been wet, so I don't have to work it too much. And I'm just going to make sure my brush is up on its toes, so it's straight up and down. And I'm standing it up. Oops, I got a big drip there because I forgot one important thing. When I take my paint from here, that's a good lesson for you to learn from me, from my mistake. When you pull your paint up, just wipe it on the edge a little bit to make sure you don't have too much and it won't drip for you like that. So I'm going to practice standing it way up on its toes, and I have a wet brush on dry paper, and it's allowing me to get these beautiful kind of silky lines because it's wet and it's flowing on there very nicely. I could get thicker ones if I lay my brush a little on its side, but it's important that it stays wet. You don't want it to be dry for this one. Now we're going to do something called dry brush. Dry brush means, and I wash my brush out carefully before I go back in my next paint color. Dry brush means that, yes, I have paint on my brush. I'm going to use this area to kind of make sure that paint goes up into my brush. But I'm literally going to use my paper towel, and now I'm drying that brush off. It still has paint in it, but it's mostly dried out. Dry brush is what I might do on top of another color if I wanted some texture. Say I wanted some wooden texture on something. So I'm going to gently add some texture. Now notice I'm not scrubbing. I don't want to ruin my brush. My brush bristles should not look like they've been scrubbed off and start to fall apart. I'm just dabbing it down, but because the water is mostly out, it's now giving me a nice texture. And now we want to do wet on wet. To do that, you need to make sure that you're washing your brush all the way out. You're going to go down into the bottom, dance around on the bottom completely. Make sure that brush is nice and clean by checking it on your paper towel. It looks good and clean. Now I need nice clean water. I'm going to wet my brush again. Now that I know it's clean, I'm going to give myself a nice wet spot on my paper. I'm wetting it first, and that's what the wet on wet means. I'm using a wet brush on wet paper, and now I'm going to get some colors out of my paint set. And I'm just going to paint on the wet paint, and notice how it looks different when I have the paper wet than it did when my paper was dry. If I'm, say, making a cloudy sky and I want it to look like the clouds are blending together, One thing you need to understand about watercolor is watercolor often does the work for you. You'll hear me say, let the water do the work. When you're doing this wet on wet technique, you don't want to keep going back and doing the blending. As this dries, it will blend itself. Now we're going to try some of those extra ones that I told you about. If you didn't have salt or you didn't have stickers or tape, you could do this instead, or just do it as an extra. Take a crayon. It can be a color crayon. I'm going to use white. Press firmly and make some kind of design. Maybe it's a snowflake design. This is going to be similar to what we just did with that spider web if you did that project, where you take a color of paint now, and if you press nice and firm with your crayon, when you paint over it, as long as your paint's good and wet and you're just flowing right over top. Notice I didn't paint around my crayon, I painted right over top. That's what we call a wax resist. So this one was a wax resist. Now you might try blending colors. If I'm going to blend a color, I'm going to try some yellow. And you notice my yellow, someone in the past has mixed a color down in it, so it's not quite a true yellow anymore. I'm going to show you in a minute that you could mix in that tray instead of. But let's do this blending first. I want it to be wet. I'm going to paint it a little further than I thought I needed it. Then I'm going to go to my next color, which is going to be this green. And I'm going to dab it off because I don't need a lot of it because it's darker. And I'm going to start with the green. And I'm very lightly letting up on it and I'm blending it. So now I've got green going blended into the yellow. So as I move my brush across, I lose the pressure. I lighten up on the pressure. I'm not letting the brush go down as far on the paper as I move across. So, one way to keep the colors in your set clean when you want to mix new colors is to get the color out of your tray and put it right here on the lid. Now, this has yellow in it. If I put it in the green, it might not make too much of a mark because the yellow is so light. But if I had red on my brush and put it in yellow, it definitely would mess up my yellow. So I'm going to wash my brush out. I'm going to put my brush just a dab into the red and mix it on my tray. Wow, that red's a strong color. It is orange, but it's a very dark orange because red's a really strong color. I want to add more yellow. Should I just put my brush right in the yellow right now? I shouldn't. What if I did and I got red in there? The thing to do when that happens is right away, before it messes up your whole yellow, is to wash your brush out. Check that it's clean on your paper towel. Dry it on your paper towel and go back in and get that out of there before it has chance to go into the yellow and mess up your whole color. If you do a good job of keeping your paint colors clean, you'll have them to use for a very long time. Now, so you could mix a new color and paint it on for me to see what new color you mixed. That could be another thing to try. New color, blending. All right, when you're all finished, you're finished with the painting, that's going to dry. But you're not finished with your paint set. It's now dirty on the lid, and you want to take care of cleaning that out. So if it's still wet, it's pretty simple. You just use your paper towel and wipe it up. If it's dried, you could take your brush, you could re-wet it, and you could actually use it to paint with if you want, so that we don't waste it. I could have done that with the orange. But once it's wet, then I can take my paper towel, and I can clean it up, so that my tray is ready for more mixing later. I like to leave my set open so it can dry. I would resist the urge of closing it and putting it away because while it's wet, if I move it around, you see what's happening. My paint is starting to run out. It tends to run into other colors. So let it sit flat and let it dry. My stickers are dry enough that I can start to peel this off. And you see what happens is it's left the shape of the tape, and hopefully it left the shape of my puppy dogs. Now that my paintings are dry, I'm going to remove the salt and put it in the garbage. I'm going to put it in my hand and get it in the garbage, or do that over the garbage can. You can see when you look close, your salt left a little kind of speckly effect to the paint. It's great for like in the sky or other things. Now you want to go ahead and cut pieces out from each one to glue into your art workbook page. So go ahead and carefully cut out a section of each one. Once you have them cut out and matched in the correct spot, in other words, if I tried salt, that's in the salt spot. Ones I did with straws, ones I did with stickers, they're all in the correct spot. Let me talk about gluing to make sure that you're making sure all of the edges get stuck down very carefully. First of all, use that messy mat. Take your paper, flip it over, use your glue stick, and go around the edges. Now that means the glue stick sits flat, and it's going around the edge to get a good thick amount of glue just on the edge, so that when I move it over into my workbook, I press firmly. Here's the part that kids often forget, and with this heavy paper, it's very important. You have to press, my hand's laying flat. It's not just the tips pushing it down, it's flattened down and it's pressing. Heavy paper like this would like to tear off of it really easily as you're moving pages in your workbook. It's really easy to get a hold of a corner, and if it's not glued down well, it will pull off. So you really have to press it to really smush that glue into both pieces of paper so that it will stick. Go ahead and glue all your pieces in, and then you are going to submit a video in Schoology telling me which one of these was your favorite techniques to use, which one maybe surprised you a little, like was something new you had tried and you didn't know about until we did this little exploration of ways to use watercolor paints.